This module is designed to give you a brief history of experimental psychology and an overview of the themes of psychological science. The roots of psychology lie in philosophy. Ancient Chinese and Greek philosophers debated about the source of human psyche and human behaviors. Confucius, for example, studied topics that remain important in even contemporary psychology. However, the history of modern psychology begins in 19th century Europe, when it first emerged as a scientific discipline, and many schools of thought were developed. Western philosophy came of age in ancient Greece, about the 4th or 5th centuries, when Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others focused on the nature of thought and behavior, and also considered the possible links between the mind and the body. Later philosophers, especially René Descartes, argued that the mind and body were completely separate, and they focused their attention on the mind. In addition to philosophy, psychology also has roots in the natural sciences of biology and physiology. German experimentalists studied simplest kinds of mental processes, simple sensations, memories, and judgments, and focused on introspection as a method for studying sensations, reporting on subjective experiences, and changes in those experiences. Weber and Fechner studied the relationship between conscious sensory experience and physical stimuli, typically using phenomenology and psychophysics. Wilhelm Wundt, who is credited with establishing the first laboratory in psychology, was interested in the structure of the mind. He focused on understanding complex mental processes. He believed they could be understood through the understanding of elementary sensations and processes. Tishner pioneered the school of thought that became known as structuralism. He used introspection to study consciousness and theorized that conscious experience can in fact be broken down into the basic underlying components or sensations. Based on this view, the reason we see a face in this picture on the right is because every aspect of this picture stimulates a conscious experience that is recognized as a face. The problem with structuralism is that experience is subjective and not entirely stimulus-driven. Also, introspective methods have been questioned because reporting on an experience often changes the experience itself. William James argued that the mind consisted of a stream of consciousness, that it came into existence over the course of human evolution, and it works the way it does because it is useful for preserving life and passing along genes to future generations. He elaborated on the effects of experience and context, and moved psychology beyond structuralism into functionalism. The idea that psychologists ought to examine the functions of the mind rather than the processes themselves. Gestalt psychology was a field founded by Max Wertheimer. The word Gestalt refers to an organized shape or a whole form, and thus the Gestalt theory focused on the whole of conscious experience and not necessarily on elemental sensations. They proposed that this conscious experience is different from the sum of its parts and in fact can be much more holistic. They influenced the study of vision and human personality and introduced the roles of patterns and contexts which are studied till today. The picture on the right is a good example of how we can see one thing in the whole and have several different parts. In this picture, most people perceive a face even though it is in fact a picture of just animals arranged in a particular way. Here is another example of Gestalt principles at work. In this picture, do you see elements, or is your mind busy organizing these elements into some familiar shapes and forms? And once you find a uniform whole, a shape that you recognize, you really cannot choose to not see it. Have you seen it yet? Picture of a dog, maybe a Dalmatian, sniffing the ground in the middle. So then here we have the perception of a form that is clearly more than the sensations that this picture generates. Subsequently, psychologists went beyond looking at elemental sensations and perceptions to studying complex behaviors. John Watson proposed the idea of behaviorism, an approach that emphasized environmental effects on behavior, and he talked about how behavior can be modified by reward and punishment. He challenged the focus of psychology on conscious and unconscious mental processes and developed the field that went on to describe the roles of different factors in learning and behavior modification. Other psychologists continued to look at mental processes operating below the level of conscious awareness, at the level of the unconsciousness, and their role on human behavior. One of them is George Miller, who is credited with defining the field of cognitive psychology. Today, experimental psychology has many goals. At the level of behavior, psychologists attempt to describe, explain, predict, and improve different behaviors, and also try to correlate those behaviors with the brain structure, function, and regulation. So research on the mind, the brain, and behavior has accumulated over many decades to produce the principles of psychological science today. Complexity is inherent in science as ideas and theories are modified with new information. So the first principle then is that psychological science is cumulative and in flux at all times. Another theme in psychological science today is the biological emphasis and the biological revolution, which has energized research. We have a much better understanding of brain chemistry, the human genome, and have the ability to watch the working brain, to image activations within the brain at different points of time, to view how different brain regions interact and produce conscious experience. The last 3 decades have seen a tremendous growth in our understanding of the biological basis of mental activities. For the first time in the history of the discipline, the full power of biology is being used to explain psychological phenomena. And finally, it is important to realize that the mind is adaptive. Adaptive mechanisms enhance our chances of survival, and an evolutionary perspective to different traits has become a hallmark in scientific inquiry or psychological inquiry. Many of our current behaviors reflect our evolutionary heritage. For example, infants won't crawl over a cliff even if their mothers are standing on the other side encouraging them to do so, even a virtual visual cliff. Another example is our preference for sweet and fatty foods that can lead to obesity. That preference made perfect sense for hunter-gatherer societies, but today, when we lead a much more sedentary life, these behaviors continue to affect our health and physiology. These are the themes that have emerged from decades of systematic research in psychology.